All of us in this room have witnessed the incredible rise of the Acton Institute since its founding in 1990. Central to this success have been many things. The support of those in this room and many others, the staff, but paramount has been the vision and intellectual leadership of Father Robert Sirico. Many of you know Father Sirico from his work as a public intellectual. He writes in the pages of prominent newspapers. He appears on radio and TV. In these settings, he is often seen combating collectivist ideas by painting a moral vision for a society free and responsible. Some of us, however, have had the privilege of seeing Father in his other role as a pastor, whether it's in his home parish here in Grand Rapids at Sacred Heart of Jesus, or as a guest preacher in many other venues around the world. In these settings, you can especially see the deep faith and begin to understand that Father's thoughts about society and about the economy are rooted in moral concern grounded in the Scriptures. And there's more. Father's an author. His recent book, Defending the Free Market, A Moral Defense for a Free Economy, is now in its second printing. So if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to do so. And he asked me to suggest to you that it makes a perfect Christmas present. Now, that's not to say that all these stellar accomplishments have completely banished the kid who grew up on the rough streets of Brooklyn. Just this week, I suggested to Father that just perhaps something he was doing during benediction didn't quite comport with the way the book said it ought to be done. He cornered me, did one of these, and whispered, "How come you're busting my chops?" Sorry, Father, it won't happen again. Father Robert Sirico.
Judge Scoville, if I knew that our conversations in the sacristy were fodder for public discussion, you are in great trouble. And who would have conceived of the idea that anything about Lord Acton's writings or thought could be humorous before this evening? I ask you, only P.J. O'Rourke. I'm just a little befuddled because I must have missed the connection you made between Nancy Pelosi and intelligence. But I'll take notes later on. No, I think the role that PJ has played for us tonight has been cathartic. He is kind of like the jovial mortician, isn't he? I mean, if you really think about what he said, none of it was funny. All of it was very sad and even dangerous. And so I come before you as the sad sack mortician to meditate with you for just a few moments on the state of affairs that we see before us. This is a very critical moment in our history. And I think it's vital that we have this winsomeness, this sense of humor, because it's kind of like the energy that we need to go forth. Because tomorrow, when we hear a press conference or a discourse or something of a new piece of legislation or a maneuver that is being conjured up by one or another politician, we won't have PJ's whispers in our ear to laugh at it. Because we see the consequences, cultural, moral, economic, that stand before us. The whole reason that Chris Maurin and I started the Acton Institute now, it's hard to believe 23 years ago. You were only 23. Chris, where is he? When you came, you were only 23 years old, right? 23 or 24 when you came. Less? 22. 22. He has worked at the Acton Institute more years than he's been alive. And we have to make some quicker progress if we're going to retire safely. But the whole reason we founded the Acton Institute was to bring common sense to these good intentions that people have, because the majority of them have good intentions. They want a prosperous society. They want those who don't have access to health care or homes or jobs or clothing or food, or you fill in the blank. They want them to have these things. The question they rarely ask is, how are these things produced in the first place? What is the moral basis? What is the context in which these things can be produced? I mean, we really live at a moment in human history that is in many ways contradictory. In the first instance, we have really, those of us in this room tonight, have pulled the ring, haven't we? We've hit the lottery. We were born at this moment and in this place. The richest society in human history, with access to more caloric intake than most of us want, and God knows most of us need. Access to clean water, sanitation, unprecedented 150, 200 years ago, even by the aristocracy. We live in the midst of opulence and disposable income. Even the televisions and the air conditioning in our homes are testimony to the wealth of nations that Adam Smith spoke about 200 years ago, which was virtually unknown in most huts and in most homes at that time. So on the one hand, we live in the midst of all of this. And it's increasing. It's not just here. Globalization is a new word for solidarity, if it's rightly understood, because it's a way in which others can be invited and participate in this circle of exchange, as John Paul the Great, soon Saint John Paul II, phrased it. But the dichotomy, the odd thing, is that we're also living in a world where the engine that creates this prosperity is despised and denounced. Now, that's not new. Envy is as old as the human heart. It goes back to Cain and Abel. The context for economic production must always be moral. We know that exploitation is possible. It's just a little bit more possible when the economy is controlled by bureaucrats and politicians. I'm happy to say tonight that, as far as I know, there were no politicians in the room. And if they are, I'm sure they have their sunglasses on after PJ's assault. But the vision we project for society is not a vision of society where people excel at the expense of other people, that zero-sum game, that pie that must be constantly divided and redivided, and where the impetus, where the inspiration for and the energy for that impetus is envy. The vision we project is a vision of solidarity and encounter, not conflict, where we encounter one another and recognize the other. We recognize ourselves in that other person. And it's just that on a practical level, on a prudential level, we see voluntary human interaction as far more efficient, far more intelligent, far more productive than agencies of bureaucracies that inhibit creativity and indeed knowledge, intelligence throughout society. And that's why we began this institute 23 years ago now, and can point to men like Pastor Brooks who have come to us and who think they've only taken from us but really have contributed to this synthesis, to this understanding that one can see a desperate and desolate city and still see potential in it. It's like that old story about the two salesmen who were sent to, where was it, Alaska, and reported back home, and the one said they were to sell shoes, and the one said, "I'm coming back home, nobody wears shoes here." And the other wrote home and said, "This is a great place, nobody has shoes yet." To see beyond what is right before us. This is the genius of entrepreneurship. This is the genius in which many of you, and I could point to you right now because I know you, the genius in which you engage every day. To see things not yet created, not yet discovered, anticipating markets for your products, anticipating the desires of people and the price they're willing to pay, even the packaging that they want it delivered in. The free and the virtuous society, and they must go together because, as one of the founders of our nation said, this nation was not conceived as possible for anyone but immoral people. First and foremost, if we lose this sense of virtue and exchange it for the cheap counterfeit of values, which are subjective rather than objective, then we exchange our birthright for something that is beneath our dignity. So we are here tonight, and I thank you for the support that you've given us. As Chris pointed out, we're a little short of our goal, and it'd be just so wonderful to wake up tomorrow to know that we've covered that and we can get back to the work that we're doing, which we're doing every day, and the young men and women who are associated with us. I'm still the oldest person on the staff of the Acton Institute, which is why I can operate an iPhone. I only have to ask for Dave Cooper, and he comes over and makes it all right again. No, we are at a very critical moment. Not the Institute, our nation, our culture, our world. And you may not know this, but this is the 1700th anniversary of the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan was a combined statement by Constantine and the Emperor of the North. They shared the chair. Constantine had been a pagan but saw a cross in the sky and conquered in the name of that cross. And a few years later, Constantine issued a decree. The Edict of Milan is commonly known as the Edict of Tolerance. It was religious freedom. Christianity had been under great oppression. This was the era prior to Constantine for 200 years where Christians were forced into the catacombs, devoured by wild beasts in the Colosseum. They were a peculiar sect as far as the pagans, the Romans, could see. They only had one wife. They believed in the sanctity of human life. They treated women with great dignity and valued women even when they'd lost their husbands, even when they had never been married. And yet they were persecuted viciously. The Edict of Milan, in terms of the institutional transformation that it made, simply guaranteed and restored the right to property of the church. That's what the Edict of Milan did. Today we need a new Edict of Milan, when our property is no longer seen as sacred. I don't say that it's absolute, but the property that you possess justly is a sacred possession because it is the result of your labor, your brilliance, your intelligence, your risk, your courage, where you have pulled things out of nature or refashioned things in one way or another and placed them at human service. That's what entrepreneurship is. That's what business is when it's free. Not when it's crony capitalism, not when it's corporate welfare, but when it's free labor exchange voluntarily with people. And that is what is being challenged. I don't mean just by particular pieces of legislation that have come down, though that certainly is part of the whole puzzle. But I mean in the common mentality of people, the culture and its desiccation that we see before us, where people no longer value their word as a contract, where they no longer uphold the sanctity of private property. Of course, the legislation that PJ has alluded to and that others in this room are working so hard against, this legislation of health care. I was waiting, by the way, for PJ, for your famous line, which I've quoted so many, many times, always attributing it to you, by the way, even though preachers are allowed to steal other people's lines. Or at least that's been the case with me. That if you think health care is so expensive now, wait until you see it when it's free. PJ O'Rourke said that. But to face this dilemma now aimed directly at the church and her institutions. My friends, our institutions that are animated by our devotion, which is the result of charity, which is the result of religious commitment, cannot be allowed to be subsumed by a state that cares only for the material well-being of people. We certainly care for their material well-being, but we see human beings as more than the sum total of their material parts. To treat a human being afterwards, after all, just as we would treat an animal. When it's hungry, give it food. When it's thirsty, give it to drink. When it's cold, put it in the barn. That is not worthy of the human person. But to see the person, the human person who stands before us as an eternal and immortal being, to take them into our care and to provide for them, that is the source of authentic charity. And what the state has created in its materialist and humanist manifestations is a mere desiccation of what we invented almost 2,000 years ago. So we must stand together in conscience against this encroachment upon human liberty, and especially human liberty as it is institutionalized in private property. That is why we must conscientiously oppose the legislation, work with others who are opposing the legislation, and hail the great heroes who are putting their reputation and their businesses on the line to defend human liberty. This extends not only to religious institutions, but also to private institutions and businesses, because we need to be running our private businesses conscientiously, also with a sense of mission. What we seek is not a class conflict. We've seen so much of that, especially these last few weeks. That's what politics is all about. Conflicts, winners and losers. We seek rather what Mother Teresa called a class encounter. She, a little nun, about that high, I had the privilege of meeting her once, who looked for all the world like E.T. when I met her, had what I consider to be one of the most trenchant and devastating critiques of Marxism I've ever heard. She said, we ought not, no, she said, we have no right to condemn the wealthy. We do not believe in class struggle and conflict, but in class encounter, where the rich save the poor and the poor save the rich. Thank you, my friends, for helping us to make that known.